Did anyone get anywhere with beginning statements that could help you create a case? You just were catching up with one. You did? A little bit? Okay. Can you see how using that outline might enable you to connect the dots that once you have them connected in your own mind, and if you simply write it out over a couple of pages, then you can go back to that document throughout the year and think about new and creative ways to tell the same story to the folks with different examples. The same principles, the same kinds of ministries, but different examples of what you're describing there. And my experience has been that that really begins to help people to understand what you're asking them to support and why it's important to support that today. One of the greatest challenges in working with pastors to develop a strong case is that piece on urgency. But it's also one of the more important pieces of it as well. Why now? Why should we be doing this now? And if you can't answer that question, you probably need to revisit what you're doing. But I think it helps you sort of think through what you're doing, and to be able to articulate why it's important to support that, how you can grow the culture of generosity. Did you have any questions about that or any thoughts as you work through it? You just want me to keep backing up this big dump truck and dumping it out? Just keep unloading, is that it? Yes. Here's one of the things. The question is about the financial implications of your solutions. This is what if you think about, and this is actually what we're going to get into next, but this is a good question. We went through a season, particularly in our Methodist churches. Back in many years ago, we would provide almost a line item budget that we would publish for people to see when we wanted to raise the annual ministry. And then the experts started telling us, well, you don't want to do that. People get all worked up about this particular area, that area. So just kind of lump them together and create a pie chart and show this area administration, this area for this ministry, and this area for that ministry. Well, then we found the challenge with that was that when we had this area for administration and we were pointing to the clergy, well, the clergy's time was divided up into all these other pieces too. And so that became really unclear as well. And so what I'm encouraging you to do is to help people to see what the particular ministries actually do cost as best you can, but also in telling that story, to talk about what the outcomes are. You connect those two things. Because if people see $100,000 for outreach, that's pretty meaningless, and they'll say, well, why are we spending that much on outreach? But if you say $100,000 for outreach and it supports this ministry and this ministry and this ministry, and through this ministry we're touching this number of lives, and through this ministry we're touching this number of lives. So you're showing the financial implications, you're helping people to put together finances and outcomes, lives being changed. And so that's one of the things that we want to work at doing in the case. So you can, and you can't put it all in just a couple of pages, but at least start spelling it out so that you can go back and even spin it out farther during the year as you're telling the stories of ministry. Yes, sir. Yep. Yep. So the comment is that the importance of of knowing your history, looking at the history and getting a sense of the ebb and flow of how activities occurred, when things would rise up, when decisions were made, and how those, if you get a sense of some of that, you'll begin to realize some of the strengths and weaknesses and the DNA of the church. Like, as was said, begin to realize that this church, particular church, waited until the new pastor came in to set the new vision, and that's the way it happened every time over 125 years, and they never really owned the vision themselves. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. Next, third step. Third piece of the framework toward visionary stewardship to grow generous faith, a culture of generosity, is to celebrate ministry impact often. Celebrate ministry impact often. Tell the story. How have lives been changed? Do it regularly. Do it in a variety of ways. Think in terms of outcomes. How many families are impacted by a particular ministry? By the discipleship, spiritual formation of your ministries, by the Bible studies, the small groups. How many families are helped through the outreach? How many missionaries are supported? Quantitative reporting is important. It takes a little work, but people want to know how effective you are being with the funds that they are giving. And failure to frequently tell these stories can easily result in a couple of things. First, church members, they begin to fill the void with their own information, and it's usually not very accurate, right? If you have a vacuum there, people will fill that vacuum with their own narrative. This may sound controlling, but it's not meant to sound that way. But the truth of the matter is, you should be guiding the narrative. You should be controlling the narrative by making sure that you're getting the information, the accurate information out. So if you don't do it, they'll fill in the narrative with their own. A second consequence, if you don't tell the stories of ministry, is that ministry, mission, and vision of the church, they become less relevant to the members, even to the people on the inside. If they aren't hearing those stories, if they don't know the impact that is being made, it will become less relevant. Telling the stories of ministry, I was talking with someone just a few minutes ago about a church I worked with, a United Methodist Church, Parkway Heights United Methodist Church in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and did 2 campaigns. And that might scare some of you, but often whenever I work with a church, we go in and I look at what they want to do and say it's going to take more than 1 campaign, folks. I don't try to oversell and underperform. I'm very honest with you. And so I said they had a building project that was about $8 or $9 million. And I said, you're probably going to raise about $5 million in 1 campaign. That would be a really good campaign for you all, because you've never raised even half that much. So make it very real. But we did that. We raised over $5 million. They built this wonderful facility that they could expand their ministry into. It was a church. It was just really a lot of activity happening. So they called me up, and I came back in, and they said, okay, we have this debt. Now what do we do? And I said, okay. And I said, we need to start telling the story of what you've accomplished. And they were sort of puzzled. And I told them, and this had actually happened. I was sitting there with waiting for a meeting to happen one day. And as I was seated there in the new building, there was a constant stream of different groups going in and out of this building. And I looked at them and I said, so what was this group? And they named that group. And what was this group? And they named that group. And what was this group? And I said, do you remember the vision that you cast when we were going to raise the money for this building? Well, yeah, we wanted to do all these things for the community. We wanted the community to be using the building. I said, do you see what's happening here? Yeah, that's right. Have you thought about telling that story? Does anyone else know that much activity? Well, no, nobody really knows that. Well, there you go. What if you start telling people about the outcomes? What if you help them see that? What if you were to take every couple of weeks or once a month, whatever works well in the rhythm of your worship services, you have some representative from one of these groups talk about what an impact they are having on the community around you and how grateful they are that they can operate out of your facility to be able to do that. You have partners in ministry. Have you thought about telling those stories and sharing how the outcomes are occurring? So what I tell churches is use a variety of settings to tell these stories. I read a study several years ago that said, and I think it's probably even more than this, but it takes 6 weeks for us to have up to 75% of our active membership in worship on the weekend. 6 weeks to get it up to 75%. So, if you tell a story on one Sunday, you probably are maybe reaching half at the most, 40 to 50% of the people that you really want to hear the story. So we have to do it at a variety of settings and a variety of ways. Speak the announcements, post the announcements, if you use a screen before and after worship, put them up there, do whatever you can. During classes, at church events, whatever activities are going on. The Lewis Center for Church Development out of Washington, D.C. area had an article that was a very interesting article, and they were talking about how we still think in the church that the main doorway for people into the life of the church is the Sunday morning worship service. That's not it anymore. Do you know that? And we really do a disservice by just counting how many people we have at Sunday morning worship and thinking that's a gauge of how effective we are in ministry. People find their way into the church through the variety of doors you have going out and others coming into the facilities, and the variety of ways that you're connecting with people out there with different service groups, different organizations, however it is occurring. And they're finding out that as First United Methodist Church, people that are doing this, and one day they may come to a class or to a worship service or to some sort of event. But often those people believe that they're part of your church long before you see them in worship. So to tell these kinds of stories in those settings is to get the word out about the outcomes, the effectiveness of your ministry. Use a variety of settings, use a variety of voices. Allow the voices to, in fact, be the people whose lives have been changed. We call them testimonials back in the day. I don't know if we still want to call them that or not, but we have an incarnational faith. Let that incarnational faith be incarnate in the people whose lives have been changed. And let people tell those stories. Use a variety of settings, a variety of voices, and a variety of media. And this is the strangest part about doing all of this. With all of the additional communication tools that we have, it's harder to communicate, isn't it? But we can't back off of trying. And we must embrace every tool that we can. Are you willing to go there? Do you use all of the social media that you can? Do you continue to use print? You have to continue to use print for some folks. But do you use technology well? Every bit of it that you can? This is the challenge that we have, and when I do capital campaigns, I talk about multi-channel communication, and we need to talk about that in the church. How many ways can we tell the same story? If you have something that's reported in church, do you put it out on the Facebook page too so people can see it? Do you constantly take little clips from your worship services and put it out there? Do you have tweets that help get that story going? Church I'm working with way on the west side of town has David Vaughn. It's Whitewater Crossing, it's called. I've worked with them. I'm starting my 4th campaign with them. And the first time I worked with them back in the mid-90s, they had about 350 people in worship. Now they have about 1,600 people in worship. They moved out to the country, out in the middle of nowhere, and I thought the guy was crazy. But he uses every way possible to talk about how lives are being changed, and to encourage people to tell that story to their neighbors, and to encourage their neighbors to be part of that kind of storyline. And by doing that, by sharing those outcomes, they always are framing the messages in changed lives, and people want to be part of that kind of story. So, that church is Whitewater Crossing Christian church. It's an independent Christian church. I'm going to talk about them in a moment because they are engaging millennials in an interesting way. Always frame the message in terms of changed lives. Do you do that? Do you talk about lives being changed? Do you talk about the outcomes? This is one of the things, as I said a moment ago, that I really learned from development professionals that they do very well. And it seems like we miss that in so many ways. We went through that stage of encouraging people to give by creating those pie charts and saying this area of ministry, and that area of ministry. And that's okay, but it doesn't really talk about what happens because of that ministry, how lives are being changed. And that's what I want to impress upon you and encourage you, and to let you think about, or to encourage you to think about it in terms of creating a conversation. Do you think about that when you're using social media and technology? That what you're doing, I guess I need to back up and say this. I've sort of started assuming this. When I started doing this ministry back in the 90s, we would do capital campaigns. And if any of you did capital campaigns, you know what you would do is you'd send stuff out. Newsletter here, brochure here, a video that you'd show people here. It was monologue. It was throwing information out and hoping that it would stick somewhere. Well, in our world today, people don't want monologue. They want dialogue. And so when you think in terms of all of these channels of communication, think in terms of how you're using them to create a conversation with folks. End with a question, inviting people to consider being part of something, or end with a question to have people respond with their own input. Invite people into that conversation. One of the principles of institutional fundraising, for you all to know, is that if you're going out and talking with a major gift person to try to get a large gift out of someone, you want to begin the conversation by asking their opinion. If you want to engage people, you want to get their opinions. You want to get them involved in a conversation. So when I talk about this case and talk about sharing the outcomes, I'm saying do it in a way that invites them to have some feedback and to participate in that conversation as well. Does that make sense? Yes. Oh, you would ask that. I just pulled that up from way back. Well, what we do whenever we're talking with people about major gifts is we'll show them the case and say, what do you think about this? What do you think the strengths are? What do you think the weaknesses are? Or is there something that we're missing? And I'd say that if you get comfortable with it, it's really a good idea to even ask those kinds of questions as you're putting information out. You know what? This is based on our mission and vision. This is what I believe is the case for what we're doing and why we're doing it and why we're doing it now. I'd love to hear from you about what you think. Is there something missing that I've left out? And get people to respond even in that sort of way. You are vulnerable when you do that, but it does help you know where they are. And you can answer questions and respond to those questions with appropriate responses and consistent responses, I think. One of the things that I do whenever we do what I call an assessment and planning study, often before a campaign or even before an envisioning process, is I have a last question in a survey of questions. And my last question is, what do you think is the toughest question we need to be able to answer well in order to do this? And get people to tell us what their toughest question for us is, or a tough question, a difficult question they've heard out there. And we pull all that information together, and I have an FAQ column that I can work with, create consistent, concise answers to, and then continue the conversation in a very constructive way. So it's that kind of thing. It's asking people to respond and give us their input. That make sense? If you have... Go ahead. So you're wanting to fund. The question is, how do you're relating this to a prison ministry, and you're wanting to fund a prison ministry. Is that right? And so you're seeking to raise funding for that prison ministry specifically through a church. You're wanting it to be a line item in the church budget or in addition to what the church is doing. Multiple churches coming together. Have you really clearly articulated what the purpose of this ministry is? And have you taken time to kind of write out a case that would help you really articulate the different pieces of it? What the outcomes, what do you expect the outcomes to be? See, I think if you do all of those things, then you can engage people with the right kind of information, and they'll come back with the right kinds of questions for you so that you can strengthen that case. That's one of the values of this, is you can strengthen that case, and you can, in fact, grow the giving. One of the principles of fundraising that the world of development uses out there is this: involvement leads to investment. Have you heard that? Involvement leads to investment. Now think about how true that is. It's true in every area of life. And so you'll see some slides on that document that you have that show that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But if you think about how true that is, that when you get people involved in a process, you will be able to get them invested in it. And one of the ways to get them involved is to get them into that conversation so they're part of the dialogue that's helping to shape the case and the purpose. The more people you can get involved in that way, the more people you will have invested in it. All right. Any other questions? All right. Good. Where was I? Use a variety of voices, use a variety of media, all the different ways you can. We can talk about that. We can ask questions about it later. But always frame the message in terms of the changed lives. I think that's so important. Now, the next step, the next piece of the framework for visionary stewardship to grow a culture of generosity is this: challenge leaders to lead. Challenge leaders to lead. Lyle Schaller, who didn't have a thought that he didn't publish, wrote so many wonderful books. They're great books. They're wonderful books. But he gave a lot to think about over the years. But in one book, The Ice Cube is Melting, What is Really at the Risk in the United Methodist Church. It was written several years ago, but this statement has stuck with me over the years. The number one point of commonality of growing churches, do you know what he says it is? Is that numerically growing churches tend to project internally consistent and clearly defined high expectations of people. Internally consistent and clearly defined high expectations of people. The most common factor clearly identified among growing vital churches is raised level of expectation among members. Remember an old story of a young mother making pancakes for her sons Will and Ben. One morning, Will was 5 and Ben was 3. And they were arguing about who would get the first pancakes for breakfast. And she looked at her sons and she said, you know, if Jesus were here, Jesus would say, you take the first pancakes. And Will looks at his little brother and says, Ben, you be Jesus today. Well, I'm not asking you to be Jesus. Just to raise the expectations of other members. New churches can build their culture with high expectations of leaders, and many members will follow. Some of you know Ginghamsburg United Methodist Church, north side of Dayton. Any of you know that church? Mike Slaughter. Mike Slaughter was working through his doctorate up there while I was working through my doctorate, and I was at a church in Middletown, Ohio, just south of Dayton, and he and I would meet and talk a lot of times, and he used to aggravate the heck out of me because Mike Slaughter would talk about how the church he was forming, you couldn't be a member unless you said you would tithe and you would do this and you would do that, and it just sounded very legalistic to me, and I think it is legalistic. But I do think that we have simply stepped so far back from that we've acquiesced to not raising the level of expectations of one another. And so how can you do it without being legalistic? I think you can. And I think that the way we can do that is that we do start with our leaders and we ask them to lead financially. It's not about a dollar amount, it's about a proportionate amount. But Do you ever talk with your board members in meetings and privately? Do you meet with members who have major gift potential and talk with them about giving? How could they take a step toward tithing? Do they give proportionately? Is blessed to be a blessing part of what they think about whenever they think about how they can give? It's a very real practical reason for adopting this principle. In the fundraising world, that idea is you build giving from the top down and from the inside out. You build giving, financial support, from the top down and from the inside out. What does that mean? The way to create momentum and to grow resources is to call upon people with greater resources to lead with proportionate giving to grow the resources. And it is also to go to the people who are on the inside, the leaders of the organization, regardless of what their level of financial resources might be, and ask them to seriously lead the way. Not that you're asking for a certain amount, you're just asking them to commit themselves and to make that commitment to financially support. The principle is used in the nonprofit world. It's actually a principle that I've embraced in development world. When we work in campaigns, we talk with pastors about identifying people of influence, affluence, and leadership. People of influence, affluence, and leadership. They are not the same people necessarily. Somebody may fit all those categories. But people of influence are those perceived leaders in the church who, if they say it's a good idea, others are going to follow. There are people in your church that are that way. Do you have them on board? Or you encourage them to lead the way? People of affluence are people who have greater resources. Are you able to talk with people who have greater resources and talk with them about giving? Do you do that? People of affluence, people who have resources, are wondering just as much as you are about how they can relate to your church budget. Do you know that? I was doing a campaign I was talking with somebody about College Hill Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati this past fall. And in that campaign, we were raising about $2.5 million. It was a pretty hefty goal for this little church that had gone through about 3 church splits and was really working to refashion itself. But during that campaign, I knew that we needed a lead gift that was probably close to $300,000. And we were working through the campaign, and we hold some meetings for leadership called leadership gatherings. We usually hold them in homes. And I was holding one of these gatherings in a home of one of the members there. And this member had just given the University of Cincinnati $5 million. So it was obviously an individual who had significant resources. Now, he was looking at the gift chart in this campaign, wanting to raise about $2.5 million and a lead gift at $275 or $290, I forget what the number was. We were standing in his home. This individual still lives in the same ranch home that he bought 40 years ago. He's just a very interesting individual, very faithful, gives to a lot of ministries. And he pulled me aside and he said, "You know, Michael, my wife and I have been talking about this, and we don't know what exactly to do." He said, and he wasn't bragging at all. He said, I could write the whole check, but I know that's not going to be good for the church. And he said, we don't know what we should do. And I said, "Tim, you see that top number. You're the person that we do know could do that number. If you'll just do that number, I'm not going to ask you to do more than that at this point. If we fall short, we'll come back and see what might be appropriate. But if you'll just do that number and lead the way, I truly believe that if people see leadership in the church really moving into this and taking on the challenge, that'll create a momentum and others are going to join in." And that's exactly what happened. He made that largest gift. The next level were those some more 6-figure gifts, and those were picked up. And in some others, they were coming out of places nobody thought they would happen. But they raised the $2.5 million. But my point of telling that story is that Tim was wondering himself, how do I relate to this? I would say to you who are pastors, You should be in regular conversation with the people who have significant gifts about their giving to the church and encouraging them in their generosity. You need to develop a comfort level with that. You're not going to try to get them to do anything that's inappropriate. But I want to say this to you. One of the things that I learned when I was involved in the Association of Fundraising Professionals, I'm still a member of that. I don't attend all of those things, but when I became really involved with the development professionals, one of the things I learned is they're talking to your people about their nonprofits. Do you know that? And you know that number that I said went from 65% to 35%? That's why. Giving has continued to increase. But the folks from the museum, the folks from hospice, the folks from the hospital, they don't mind talking to your people about giving. And they will talk about the outcomes. They will talk about their mission, but they'll talk about the outcomes, and they'll talk about how their giving will help make those outcomes even more real. So one of the things to realize is that as we talk about asking leaders to lead, it's talking about engaging people of influence, engaging people of affluence, and engaging people who are in leadership who may not be all that influential. They may not have great resources, but you know what? They're giving their life to your church, and you just want to encourage them in their giving. You're not going to try to drive them into anything they shouldn't do. Just encourage them in their giving. They'd probably appreciate the conversation. We need to move away from being frightened about talking about giving. So in that presentation that you have there, one of the things that you'll see are some slides that describe something that was very interesting to me. It's one of the slides is a slide of The Lost Art of Disciple Making. It's a book by Leroy Imes, an old book about making disciples. And there's a diagram that shows kind of the path where someone moves into faith, into being a disciple, becoming a convert, then they become a disciple, then they become a servant, they become a servant leader. Well, when I did my doctorate, I came upon that book, and it was part of what I wrote about and included. It's actually part of what I used in the church that we were able to quadruple. If you turn the page, there's a page that shows an image out of a book by a woman named Terry Axelrod. She owns a company called Benavon. It used to be called Raising More Money. And Benavon works with financial institutions and helps them create a culture of generosity by moving people through an interesting process. Do you see the similarities there? When I was president of the institutional division at RSI, we worked hand in hand with Terry Axelrod and Benavon in some projects. And so I was having lunch with her one day, and I said, Terry, let me show you something. Terry's Jewish, so I knew she'd never read Leroy Imes' book. And I said, let me show you something here. And I showed her that diagram, and I showed her diagram, and then I showed her how I laid them over the top of each other. And basically what you see is that if we're taking people into a deeper relationship with God, a deeper walk with Christ, a deeper sense of faith, we also have the opportunity to take them into a deeper understanding and a greater expression of generosity. They go hand in hand. And so I come back to, we need to be comfortable talking with people about giving and encouraging them in the giving. Ask your leaders to lead. Next step, next piece of the framework that grows a culture of generosity. If you're looking at a stewardship process, involve at least 10% of your church in the activity of the process. Get them involved in the process itself. One of the worst mistakes churches make today is that they get a stewardship team of 5 or 6 people, plan out a stewardship campaign, then send out a couple of mailings and expect that people are going to be excited and involved and invested to give. You remember that statement I made a while ago? Involvement leads to investment. Lack of involvement leads to a lack of investment. And so when you involve people in the process, and it doesn't mean you ask people to go out and ask others for money. That scares everybody to death. But it does mean you create a team. If you have 300 families in your church, you create a team of 30 people that will call 10 families each and say, hey, in 2 weeks is our commitment weekend. It's going to be a big day in the life of the church. There's material coming out about it. We've been talking about it for weeks. Hope you'll be there with us. You've involved 30 more people, maybe 30 more families, just in making a simple phone call. Variety of ways that you can do that, because involvement does lead to investment. Here's where I picked up how important that has been in the history of our church. How many of you remember the old Every Member Canvas campaigns? Remember the old Every Member Canvas? For those of you that don't remember it, it was a process where we would build teams. Really, they were typically teams. A couple of people would go out in pairs to visit people, to ask them to make a pledge. But we typically, many of the churches would have like captains who would enlist people beneath them, and then they would pair up people. And so we had, a number of folks who were signed up to go out on a particular Sunday afternoon. We would visit. Every member was visited and a pledge card in hand, and would ask people to make their pledge for the following year. Well, that doesn't work anymore. People wouldn't open the door for us. And basically, I think it doesn't work because of the NFL, because Sunday afternoons are too sacred for the church anymore, so that isn't going to happen. But this is what happened in the old Every Member Canvas process. We developed those groups. We set people up in teams. We would worship together on a Sunday morning. Usually we'd have kind of Sunday dinner together following worship. And then before those teams went out with 4 or 5 cards in hand, they did one more thing. What else did they do? They prayed and they made their own commitments. Before they went out, they made their own commitments. Do you know what the expectation was? You would typically receive 60 to 70% of your budget from that group. They were involved, and they would be more invested. That's the way I saw it unfolding. And so, for some reason, we've forgotten that if you get people involved, they become more invested in it. So I think that it's really important for us to sort of reclaim that and think about how we can, in fact, involve people in that process and not just have a small group do that. Because again, as we broaden the base of understanding about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and we're connecting the dots that we're asking people to support is really in support of these things happening and these outcomes that we're talking about, the broader that base is, the more invested people will be. So I encourage you to think in terms of having about 10% of the folks involved in the part of that campaign. The final piece of the puzzle of building this framework is, and this is counterintuitive for most of us, give church families multiple opportunities. Provide multiple opportunities to give. Multiple opportunities to give. We think that we're hounding people if we talk too much about money. And if we talk about money, it may feel like we're hounding them. But if we talk about 2 things, about being generous with your resources so that these lives can be changed, that's a different approach. And if we talk about, this isn't really about the church needing your money, but it's about us being created to be giving beings, and we help people to realize that the church is simply an avenue through which their generosity can flow, then that's a different approach as well. And I think that's really the approach that we need to take. And if we do that by giving people multiple opportunities, they will find different things that interest them, and they will support the church ministries more as they experience those different avenues of ministry. The different ways that we can offer people to give are those are constantly changing in our world today. Hopefully, in your church, you have the electronic giving happening. People have it pulled out of their accounts if that's the way they want to give. You doing that? All right, good. How about mobile giving? Mobile giving. apps. Let me tell you about Whitewater Crossing again. I emailed them on my way down here to check in to make sure I had this information correct. In the last 18 months, giving through their mobile giving has gone up 90%. 90%. And in 2017, it's gone up 60%. One of the things that they've been doing is sort of interesting. I think it's a great idea. They call it the dollar difference. On Sunday, they say toward the end of the service, we're going to pass the plates around one more time, or use your mobile app, throw in an extra $1. We're going to do something with that money, and we'll tell you next week what a difference it has made. They've been doing that for about 5 or 6 months. And the minister said that it's grown to tens of thousands of dollars each week that are being given that are making a difference several different ways throughout the community. So are you using mobile apps and mobile giving? In talking with them about this, we were together and we were talking through planning the campaign. And talking with them about it, they've said, what we've realized is this is how the millennials are entering into giving into our church. They may not be giving a lot, but they're starting a giving pattern. And the guy that follows this, his name's Chris, he even said in his email to me, he said, what we've seen is that most of the giving through the mobile app is either happening during the service, toward the end of it, or right after the service. So I don't know if you're afraid of getting into that or not, or if you're embracing it, but it sure seems to me that if you want to engage millennials, you want to use the avenues that they will use to give. And, the texting a certain message to give $5 to this, that started a number of years ago, and it's really picked up steam, and that is the way the younger generations, in fact, wants to give. Do any of you have a success story with that at all? Experience with that? Are any of you doing it? All right, doing it some? How long have you been doing it? 18 months, okay. You have a 90% increase? No, I'm just kidding. They really get it out there. So it's just interesting how that, but it's a tool to use, and that's good. That's good. Some others, I saw another hand go up. You all are using it? Okay, good. Yes. What the church does with it. Yep, it absolutely is. The how you give, and I'll be candid, I struggled with this because I'm an ordained minister. The offering after proclamation of the word, was that hammered into us? Huh? So having that offering at that point, and I get it taken out of my account each month, my giving, and it's really convenient. But for a long time, and I still sit there when the offering plates go by, and I've said to the pastors, give me something I can put into the plate. And they actually have a little card now that we can fill out and put in that we're going to pray or something along those lines. But it was we made it such a sacred act that we've been slow to embrace the avenue, and it's not necessarily how it's done, it's the fact that it's done and what happens with it. Yes? Right. Right. Yep. Yes. Tax reporting. It's done. Yep. It does expedite some things, yes. Oh, is that right? I've not heard that one before. That's a good one, yes. A credit card? Yeah, well, yeah. I've not heard of anybody using credit cards a lot, but that was sort of the old joke back in the day before all this other electronic giving was possible. Yeah, a lot of churches do have kiosks where you can do that following the church. But I think the trend now is to go to the mobile apps that just make it all happen, because they can be used for so many other things as well. Any other thoughts about that? Okay, one other thing that I want to share with you about this idea of multiple opportunities to give. And that is based on a book that you have on one of the slides. And the book is called The 7 Phases of Philanthropy. Now, what I want to say to you is, when I talk about giving people multiple opportunities to give, what I'm encouraging you to do is to think about people more individually than we typically do. We usually have treated everybody in our church the same and think that everybody will be motivated to give just because we say this is what the church is doing, here's the budget, just give. Now, we've already talked about one of the reasons that doesn't work, millennials that we would like to engage. Though they give much smaller amounts. So how can we engage them through the mobile apps, different ways? How can we use technology for that group that doesn't carry cash? They don't write checks very often, so they don't go to the mailbox. I was in a meeting with a millennial. Do you know this? Yeah, this is something for you all to be aware of. You may know this. I was shocked. I was in a meeting, again, working with a church for a campaign, and we were talking about mailing out an invitation for some meetings. And a young woman, she was in her 20s there, and so we said, okay, for people to have it, for us to be able to call to follow up on that invitation, we need to back up to here and back up to right here. Gives us time before the meetings. She said, well, if you want me to see it, you need to back it up to here, a full week earlier. You know why? She said, I go to the mailbox once a week. There's nothing ever really in there that I want to see. So I don't go more than once a week. Did you know that? That's really part of the routine. They get it all here. They don't spend time. They'll go out there when it's getting overflowing, or if they have to. Yes. Reading email is getting less and less by that group. This book talks about differentiating between what motivates people to give in a different way, though. The 7 Phases of Philanthropy by Prince and File. These guys have done a study on what is it that motivates people to give, and how can you cultivate that in these folks. And they talk about these 7 different types of people. They talk about the communitarian, the devout, you'll see those on a slide in there, the investor, the socialite, the altruist, the repayer, and the dynast. And just a quick summary of what they are describing here. The communitarian. The communitarian is typically a small business owner in your community. They're usually people that are very interested in things that will better that community. And so if you can describe a ministry that is going to make a difference in your local community, that group is one that will get on board with that. That's what sparks their interest. The devout. Doing good is God's will. Well, that's the group we've been playing to the whole time, right? So I don't need to say too much more about that. That's the group we're most comfortable speaking into. What about the investor, though? Doing good is good business. Here's something to think about. I had a church member one time come to me. She worked in a bank. She was a bank teller. And she told me this story. She said, you know, Michael, almost every December, I have someone come up to me and say, I was just with my financial advisor who said I need to give away more money this year. Do you have any ideas where I can give it? Do you know that goes on? So let me ask you this. What do you do beginning in October and November to encourage year-end giving to your church? Now, I know you don't want to encourage that too much because it makes it so, but we already have a curve at the end of the year where a lot of giving happens. But let me remind you Those development professionals that are out there are sending out those messages, and they're not afraid of making that curve fly up too high for their organizations. So if you don't engage in that process at that point and keep people's attention to think in terms of how they might benefit the church, maybe you break it down into some specific areas that people could give toward. You give away Bibles at a third grade. Do you want to sponsor the piece of our ministry that gives away these Bibles, or a youth camping scholarship or something? Maybe you break it down in that way. People respond to that, but do you encourage year-end giving so that the person who looks at tax records and thinks in terms of what the tax benefits will be is going to respond to that? Were you going to ask or make a statement? Somebody over here had a hand flying. No, nobody? Okay. Yes. Well, you do have to give, and you have to give more, and you can help people grow by encouraging that giving. What about the socialite? Do you see that slide that's describing this, the socialite? You know who the socialite is? That's the person who loves to put together the big event that raises money. I hate putting those things together. That is not my life. I don't like doing that. Some people love doing that, and I find those people, because I need those people to put together those kinds of events. You have those kinds of people in your church. Now, you don't want them running everything in the church. You don't want to be an event-driven budget, which some organizations become. That's a problem. But do you give the person who's a socialite an opportunity to express their interest in how to get people to give and to put together some of those kinds of things? The altruist. Doing good just feels right. How do you tell the story of making lives better, of changing lives, so that somebody who wants to do what is good, just wants to do what is good, will respond to that? For the altruist, sometimes we may be, this is going to sound, some of you may not like this, but sometimes for the altruist, we may get too heavy-handed with the Jesus message. They just want to do good and feed people. You know, certainly we offer the gospel to them and we help them grow into that. But you got to understand, not everybody is there where you are. We know that's who Jesus calls us to be. But sometimes, in order to get this person to respond, we need to use verbiage that encourages them. What about the repayer? What about somebody who has benefited in a significant way from a ministry of your church or a ministry of the church? Do we find ways to remind them of that benefit and how they can repay and make things happen? I was telling John a little bit earlier that the church that we attend, where I'm helping with the endowment, a woman who was helped early on in a scholarship she gave $1.5 million to the endowment to create a scholarship fund for high school students to go into college. She wanted to repay. And I'll tell you the truth, she almost pulled it back because the minister wasn't handling it well. He didn't want that kind of specific giving. He wanted everything to just sort of go into general giving so that it could be directed. Now, I understand the idea behind wanting it that way, but it isn't that way. And so she almost didn't give it. And several people had to step in and sort of work through the process so that, and now high school students are benefiting from this in significant ways, the repair. And then finally, the dynast, doing good as a family tradition. We know families that have been traditionally very philanthropic, and that's part of what their families do. But the problem is, often we as pastors are a little bit hesitant to go to them and talk to them about giving to the church, because we know that every other organization is talking with them as well. And I just remind you again that those other organizations' development officers aren't shy about going to them. So, visionary stewardship. These are the thoughts that I have about how to create a culture of generosity. And in the end, what I'm saying here with these last steps is think specifically about the people who are in your church and how you can engage them with a variety of different stories and a variety of different avenues for them to participate in being generous in their faith. So do you define your mission and vision to set your course? Do you develop a clear case for ministry? Do you work through that process? Do you celebrate ministry impact regularly? I could go in, I'll wait for a question and answer. All of these things create stories in my mind that I can tell you, but we need to go some Q&A here. Do you challenge leaders to lead? Do you involve many members in the stewardship process? And do you provide multiple opportunities for giving? I think that these are the ways that we can encourage people to be generous. When I was a pastor of a church in Newark, Ohio, anybody ever heard of Newark, Ohio before? No way. You've heard of Newark? How do you say it then? Newark. All right, you've heard of it. You've heard of it. You've heard of it. I was a pastor of First United Methodist Church in Newark, Ohio. And we were getting ready to do a campaign. And it was a small renovation campaign, $750,000. And a gentleman came into my office. John came into my office. John was the president of the local bank. He's the only person that literally I would see people have tears in their eyes as they talked about what a wonderful man he truly is. Very generous, very giving, very loving, just a great guy. John came into my office when he knew that we were doing this campaign, $750,000, and he sat across from me and he said, Michael, I know that when you do a campaign like this, you're going to need a gift of $75,000. I said, okay, I didn't know that, but he was telling me, and it was good. I was glad to learn that. I have learned that since, but I did not know that back then. And he said, I want you to know that I'm going to give that because I truly believe God has blessed me and significantly blessed our lives. And I truly believe that's who I'm called to be, is to just to help lead the way in those kinds of things. And then he said, you know, I want you to know a little bit more about where I am in all of this. He said, I'm involved in a lot of capital campaigns like this around the city here. And I said, yeah, I know that and I've heard that. And he said, often whenever a campaign like with the Red Cross recently or the Quai that was last year, he said, often people will call me and say, John, what are you going to do? Others who had significant resources wanted to know what he was going to do, and they were going to bench their giving based on that. Do you know those conversations go on? Do you know that? Among people of affluence, that they call one another and say, well, what are you going to do? Well, what are you going to do? And then they start talking it through a little bit. I suggest you be part of that conversation, but again, we can go back to that. He said, so they call me and say, John, what are you going to do? And he said, I always tell them, well, don't give so much that it hurts, but give so much that it feels good. And then he smiled and he said, and I always tell them that's more than when it hurts. More than when it hurts. He's talking about being invested in something bigger than we are, isn't he? And I've always remembered that, and I've told that story a number of times as I've worked with people and talked with people who have significant means. It's not about giving so much that it hurts, but it's giving so much that it feels good. And when you feel good about it, you know you're invested in it. So that's what I have to say. Thanks for your time today. All right, John.